Welcome to Rising Up for Justice, a special weekly series presented by Rising Up with Sonali, an independently produced subscriber-supported program syndicated to radio stations, free speech TV, and podcast platforms. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer. Our nation and our world is overrun by billionaires and bigots, but they are few and we are many. On this series exclusive to subscribers of Rising Up with Sonali and viewers of Free Speech TV, we'll hear from organizers in the movements for social justice, and we'll dig into the nuts and bolts of values, strategies, tactics, narratives, and building power. This week, we're joined by Chaumtoli Huq, founder and editor of Law at the Margins, a law and media nonprofit that amplifies the perspectives of those marginalized by the US's legal and broader political and economic systems. Welcome to the program, Chaumtoli.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we talk to people who are involved in organizations that are very big and very small. And although I understand that your organization has been around for nearly a decade, it is a nimble and small organization. How do you summarize the work that it does to a national audience, the main issues that you work on, your organizational goals, if you will?
Yes, absolutely. So you're absolutely right. We've been a nonprofit organization at the intersection of law and media and policy for about a decade. We are primarily a volunteer-driven organization, membership-based, working closely with organizations and individuals who are at the front lines of justice. And so through our work over the years, we've conducted trainings, webinars. We've done sort of original reporting on social justice issues such as immigration, housing, national security, around global issues such as around Palestinian liberation, Rohingya genocide. And we've done this through a number of formats, through curated conversations, through original reporting. And primarily the role is to provide a counter narrative to some of the established sort of ideas around laws and the legal system and politics. And the goal is by shifting the narratives, we're able to actually have an impact on the policies. And that's primarily has been our work for the last decade. And I'm here to talk about a recent initiative called Law Plus Liberation.
And I want to definitely focus on that because it seems as though that is very much central to your work around narratives. But just sticking to the issue of law for a minute, we are living at a time when, although it is supposed to theoretically be the case that laws should simply be enforced as they are written, that they are adjudicated in courts, they work their way up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, our legal system is deeply politicized now more than ever, especially with the US Supreme Court essentially signing away the rights of marginalized communities in the service of making Donald Trump and the most powerful executive we've had perhaps ever in the United States. So how does that inform and frame the work that Law at the Margins has been doing? How has it changed since Trump has come into power?
Sure, it's maybe helpful to step back and give your audience a little bit of context of my own work. So at the moment, I am a law professor at CUNY School of Law, which is a public service law school. But prior to that, for about 2 decades, I was what's called a movement lawyer. So working in very much close proximity to social justice organizations around a wide range of issues. And so one of the things that I think that people have this mistaken view is that all of a sudden during the Trump administration that we see this the way that the law is like implicated actually in the creation of like inequalities, or I think the most troubling to the state is our entire democratic structures. But we have to actually understand that law has been implicated in this from United States founding. And so, without sort of going into the so long duration history of that, that's a lot of what we do at Law at the Margins to kind of like get us to rethink the relationship of law and social movements. So with that, I think what we're seeing in the United States in the second Trump administration is the vulnerability and the weaknesses of our constitutional and democratic system. We've never had to really encounter how is it possible that we can have a elected government that is authoritarian. And for those of us who are from countries outside of the United States, myself, I'm not born in the United States, I'm born in Bangladesh, which recently in 2024 went through an entire sort of revolutionary sort of uprising. And we understand that actually that democratically elected governments can also be authoritarian, utilizing the systems of law. What we're seeing actually is the how much the legal system can be utilized towards maintaining and actually creating these inequalities. So I can just to kind of make this more concrete, let's look at it in the context of immigration. That's the first episode that our series is going to cover. Some of the issues regarding deportation have been existing in immigration law way before Trump, even back to 1996 during the immigration laws that were being changed. That if you had a criminal record, it made you vulnerable to potentially being deported. And so these architecture, the legal architecture that existed, is now enabling this administration to be aggressive. Now, it doesn't mean it's the same old. And so therefore we shouldn't pay attention to it. I think what this administration is doing is utilizing the existing system, reinforcing this idea of this like the executive has should have the power to do whatever its agenda is, and you're seeing the Supreme Court kind of capitulating to that. And Congress are sort of like, with their hands up, like, oh, what do we do? I think shows the vulnerabilities of our system. Once we were little, if you were in maybe elementary school in the United States, you were told the three branches of government and how they were checks and balances. And I think right now what we're observing is these ruptures within the system that are legally allowing the administration, in some instances, not all are legal constitutionally, but I also think it's important for folks to realize that it's not just enough to challenge the legality, because while there might be successes at the lower court level, what we are seeing when it gets to the Supreme Court, there is in different ways the Supreme Court giving a certain pass to the administration. So I think for us at Law at the Margins, what we realized is that we really need to educate the public about how the law is working here, how it's working in terms of social movements, but also for broader democracy and the broader public. And that's what we've been trying to do over the years. And I think now this public education is needed more than ever. And that relates to our sort of new series on law and liberation.
Let's talk about law and liberation. This is one of the ways in which your organization, Law at the Margins, one of the strategies for really achieving your goals. Tell me when it's launching, and what are the platforms? Because people are kind of moving away from mainstream media because they feel so abandoned by it. But in some ways, that can be an opening then for those communities who've always been kind of shut out, right, out of mainstream media spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. So Law plus Liberation, it was launched in October and October 1st. And the purpose of the series is a public education series. And it's primarily hosted on our Instagram platform, and partly because of a recognition that the way in which people consumed, because we're really trying to reach a broader audience. When Law at the Margins was first started, our goal was to reach, kind of you know, social justice lawyers, organizations who needed a resource hub for each other. But what we're finding now in this political moment is that it's really important for those of us who, including myself, sort of knowledgeable around sort of legal structures and involved in social movements to like really provide an explication on like what's happening. There's lots of information, mostly misinformation or misunderstandings about our political, economic, and legal system. And so the Law Plus Liberation, what it intends to do is to reach the general public. And so our choice of kind of using Instagram and it will be disseminated through other outlets, in terms of our Twitter and our website. But what we found is that a lot of folks are kind of receiving their kind of media information through Instagram and TikTok, but we're starting with Instagram as sort of we're visually being able to communicate on some of these like issues, breaking down myths. We're asking interviewees that we're talking to, not just to talk sort of as a policy wonk, but really to break down complicated issues into ways in which that the general public can understand. So, for example, we're asking, interviewers to folks that are upcoming episodes. For example, Professor Shah, who is a immigration justice advocate, about what are the myths on immigration law. Jaree Thompson, who looks at the intersection of criminal defense strategies and how do movements build capacity. We're asking also, what do movements need to do now at this moment to like really shore up their strength? So the idea always has been to present information in a way that is accessible, that can be applied, and that can be operationalized. Because it's no longer can we afford to talk amongst each other in sort of a very sort of small group, that we really need to figure out ways in which to speak to a broad audience that's being impacted by some of these pressing issues and who want to know. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of information. And I think you mentioned that with the decentralization of media platforms, you're right that it provides a tremendous opportunity. Law at the Margins has been able to function in that way as a kind of a small player in this larger media ecosystem. However, it also produces some challenges. And the challenges is that there's a lot of information. And what I sort of came to observe is that there's not a lot of guidance for folks in terms of how do you navigate, discern, and kind of evaluate the information. And so through Law Plus Liberation, what we want to do is to help those who are followers and sort of who are following the series to be able to kind of navigate and build their own sort of tools of like, how do I sort through this abundance of information? Because there's a lot of
Right.
information, but how do we navigate through them?
Right. And there's plenty of people who seem like they know what they're talking about on social media, right? In so many different realms. You've got the influencer class, and there's
Yes.
no, generally speaking, if people can kind of crack the code of how they break through the algorithms to reach people's feeds, they get more attention. But sometimes to crack that code, they might have to exaggerate. The more sensationalist your information, the easier it is to gain followers, which is just basically a system ripe for abuse. And then ultimately, all these platforms are owned and operated by billionaires who can and do change the rules at
Yes.
any time. So those are
Yeah.
always challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we recognize that we are in a economic political system where we don't own the technologies of the media technologies. But what we do control, and I think this is true for yourself and your show, is the content creation, right? So I might not be able to decide which platform to utilize, and it has all of its challenges, all of what you mentioned around influencers and algorithms and also censorship that's happening. We anticipate that our content might get sort of shadowed and censored because we're really going to talk about sort of real issues. But I think that no one can control our ability to be able to create the content.
Right.
And I think that that gives Law at the Margins that, you mentioned like the nimbleness, the independence. And I think that that has always been our strength, is that I think folks are coming to our site to like look for like, okay, how do we make sense of the current politics? And this new series shifts in the way that it's really trying to speak to a broader audience. So it is trying to kind of navigate a little bit. We do want people to follow and get the followers and influences. We do want to play a little bit of that game, but primarily because we want this material and content to get out to a wider public.
And Chaumtoli, what is your hope that audiences will take and learn from your the content that you're going to create through Law Plus Liberation, this new initiative with Law at the Margins? You hope that people walk away with a greater sense of empowerment of what can be achieved, and also just knowing the information so that they can navigate the limitations put on our civic activism and ability to function.
I think one of the things I hear a lot these days is a sense of despair of how can I plug in, and a certain sense of almost like, paralysis, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so overwhelming. Every day, every week, there's something that's sort of coming at people, and that's very real. And so I think with Law Plus Liberation, what the one way I sort of describe it is, it's like going to school, but you get some very practical strategies and tools that we hope that individuals who are listening and following the series then apply it in their day to day. So it's a very diffuse model. It's a model of popular education that actually has its antecedents in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and also around revolutionary struggles around the world. This is something that's very uncommon in US social movements. This is something I see from being from South Asia, that all movements have a study circle, a political education kind of wing, a research component to inform the strategies of their work. And so some organizations do that within their nonprofit sort of structure. And I think what Law at the Margins is trying to do with this series is create this political education, space for people to be able to access, and then take what we're actually talking about, because the way in which all the content is curated is very intentional, is that then people can take that information and then actually, in a decentralized way, take it down to the grassroots. And so the idea, that's really my hope, is that, for example, when someone listens to our upcoming episodes, just to give you a kind of a flavor, as I mentioned, is Professor Shah, who's a professor of immigration law at Suffolk, breaks down strategies that immigrants have used to counter ICE. And so the goal is that people can listen to kind of what she's saying and then implement certain strategies in their localities. Jeree Thomas talks about how do we build the movement infrastructure, the organizational capacity to take her wisdom and think about how can we actually strengthen our organizations. So it's really intended to be very practical oriented, to be able to give folks tools, but also tools that are informed really very much by social movements and social movement history. And that's the last thing there's one thing I do want to emphasize is that a lot of times people are, express a kind of wonderment, like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening in America, right? And then I would have to say, well, this has happened before, during, for example, people are now invoking the McCarthy era. People are invoking the time period after World War I when Black radicals were deported and were actually stripped of, Paul Robeson, for example, was stripped of his passport as a US citizen. And so I think that we need to be informed of these past, what I call movement histories, and so that we then know how to respond to them in the present. Again, not that it's the same, we're in 2025, but there's a lot of lessons that we need to go back and learn from. And so I think that's the political education that Law Plus Liberation intends to do. So we will speak with lawyers, organizers, historians, artists as well. Artists have played a key role in terms when we're not allowed to speak or to write, and where there's punishment that's happening with speech, which is happening in a very aggressive manner now. Art has always been this way by which music, where people have been able to express themselves. And so I think that we also want to tap into the ways in which like artists have engaged with, legal and economic and political
Right.
issues, and we've seen that over the years.
Let me ask you, Chaumtoli, how does your organization's work fit within the broader context of the contemporary social justice universe? You mentioned you are growing from traditions that are more prevalent outside the United States in the global South, but are there natural allies here in the universe of social justice movements who you see, whose work yours fits into?
Yes, so we because at the end we're primarily a independent media organization. And so I think that we have always seen a natural alliance with progressive independent media. So in the past, I know we've collaborated. Some of our content has been sort of reprinted and reproduced by, Truth Out, Jacobin, all of the sort of like progressive labor notes, these kind of progressive media. But I think what distinguishes us within the landscape is, I think, our understanding of the relationship of law and movements together. So, in a way that legal organizations aren't necessarily plugged in with social movements, and then social nonprofit organizations aren't always necessarily aware of the sort of ins and outs of like sort of the legal system. And I think what Law at the Margins has been able to do is sort of bridge that gap, but through use of narrative. So because the primary mode by which we operate is through, and it's a term I think that you utilize, which is, and we use it too, is narrative justice. Is how does narrative shifts change and lead to concrete policy shifts and or concrete changes for for marginalized communities. One of our articles from a comrade who had visited him jail and said, hey, you wrote about solitary confinement. I'm in solitary confinement and I'm being retaliated for this, and thank you, sister, for writing this. And it was at a moment where, those moments like where you don't have a lot of resources and you think you're going to full shop. And it was so inspiring because I thought that even if one person somehow and I'm right now physically in Harlem, New York, if someone in California who's incarcerated, who's organizing within prison walls against solitary confinement, somehow gets one of our articles and is managed to find inspiration, then that's powerful. We have a really committed membership, and now to be able to connect with someone like Mwalimu in this way, and then be able to platform him on our sort of show is I think makes me feel like, okay, you know what? Even if we're, someone called us, small but mighty, scrappy but fierce. I think those are the terminologies that I get you
Yeah.
described. And I'll take it because you know what? If I can get this one Walamu or the number of marginalized folks that we get to really uplift, and I would feel that like on the metrics, that funders use, right? They may not value that, but on the metrics from a movement perspective, that is something that and I hope your listeners value too.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Chaumtoli, for joining us today. Very quickly, give out your website and the social media handle.
Sure. So it's lawatthemargins.com. And on Instagram, it's at Law at Margins. And you can find all of our social media handles if you go directly to Law at the Margins. And there's also there a link to support to become a movement member. You can also just email me directly at lawatthemargins@gmail.com. And
And we'll
I
post links
appreciate you,
to
Sonali,
those from.
for hosting and for this conversation. I know you've been out there in the field and just really an inspiration. So thank you for
I
covering our
appreciate
work over
that.
the years.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. My guest has been Chaumtoli Huq, and we are talking about the organization that she founded and is the editor of Law at the Margins, a law and media nonprofit that amplifies the perspectives of those marginalized by our legal and broader political and economic systems. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, and this is Rising Up for Justice, a new weekly half-hour series exclusive to viewers of Free Speech TV and subscribers of my long-standing program, Rising Up with Sonali. Find out more at risingupwithsonali.com.